Welcome everybody, my name is Steve Bartlett. I'm a technical marketing engineer here at HPE Aruba Switching, and I'm going to tell you about at least one feature as part of the AOS-CX 10.14 release that has just landed just recently. So let's go straight in. Workload groups for the CX 10,000. So many of you will know that the CX 10,000 has an integrated stateful firewall, so great solution. And workload groups, this particular feature is applicable to where we apply the security policy to help support the network administrator in making their lives so much easier. And we'll see how that does it in a moment. So the workload group feature, previously in beta, is now fully supported as part of the 10.14 release. And the feature itself is a logical grouping of endpoint IP addresses or workload objects based on one or more workload labels or tags. And with this workload groups, this allows for the creation of security policies based on labels, abstracted away from the IP addressing. And this provides a much more flexible way for creating rules between groups of applications without having to track those IP addresses. So as an example, let's take a tiered web application with a before and after deployment with workload groups to see how it actually works and the benefits it provides. So in this example, we've got three flows. We've got flow 1 coming from our user access to our front end web access, and flow 2 going from our web access to our application orders layer, and then flow 3 from our orders app layer down into our database. And for illustrating purposes, these are unidirectional flows. So with all these flows, let's assume that we have an explicit permit. And that explicit permit between the layers, so we've got an any permit to all these front-end web servers. And then from between the tiered layers, from the web server, we'd obviously need each web server to communicate with each app device. And from each app device VM, we need to allow the connectivity model down into each DBase layer. So if we was to look at our policy for these three flows that are traversing our CX 10,000 firewall, firewall, stateful firewall, it may look something like this. So we've got three rules for flow 1 for those three VMs, any device connecting to 3 IP addresses for each of the web tier. Flow 2, obviously we've got 3 web VMs, and each web VM needs to connect to each app layer, so that generates 9 rules, I think, is there. And the same with flow 3, the app layer needs to connect to the DBase layer, and each app VM needs to connect to each DB1, DB2, DB3 VM. Likewise, it generates all these rules. So as you can see, that this particular activity in terms of just general 3 simple flows generates an awful lot of rules. So if we was to take that out and extrapolate that to maybe 20, 30 server farm size between tiers, you know, you've got a big rule set to manage, especially if they've got to go into data warehousing, etc. So we use workload groups to simplify and make the policy administration more dynamic with VMs residing in the vSphere. So to do that, what we need then, first of all, there's a couple of things we need to do. So first of all, we have an integration. First of all, we have an integration between the Policy Services Manager and vCenter. And with that, in vCenter, we can then assign each VM a particular tag and give it a nice reference. So we can have web 1, web 2, web 3, app 1, app 2, app 3, or app server 1, app server 2, and same with the database. And all these tags are pulled into the policy services manager and are resident in the PSM. And those tags can be grouped together and given a label. So this is exactly what happens. So you can see where this is going. It's very straightforward. So in workload groups, we now, for instance, have a label, workload group label called orders-web, and behind that particular workload group are 3 tags that have been imported into the PSM, and with it their IP addresses, and now they're associated with that workload group. Likewise for orders-app, we've got three tags imported into the PSM, and those 3 tags have been given a workload group called orders-app. Same with orders-dbase. So what this actually means is our policy can look very different. So on the right here, we've got all these flows with an explicit permit, and on our new policy rules with workload groups, for instance, we've got that down to 3 effectively rules, because we're now using the workload groups, and behind the workload groups are the effectively labels and with their IP addressing, so we don't have to reference the IP addressing. So we've got this abstraction from the IP addressing, which makes our life as administrators that much easier. So if we're looking at adds, moves and changes, instead of having to deal with all these individual IP addresses, we now just have to reference our web, orders web, our orders app, orders dbase, or just remove a tag from that particular workload group, and we don't have to change our policy at all. So very, very easy a solution. So this all is with reference to applying to security policies. Policies no longer need to reference IP addressing. They can reference the workload groups, and behind the workload groups we have these tags imported from the vCenter, and this supports this dynamic scale out of workloads with additions and deletions and general changes that we effectively just have to manipulate the workload group if we wanted to add moves and changes. Very, very easy. We don't have to actually change the policy itself. So a lot of more dynamics come into play when we use this system, as we don't need to reference the IP addressing. So simplified dynamic policy administration, gotta be a good thing, right? And this feature, workload groups for the CX 10,000, is now available on AOS-CX 10.14 release. That's all I had for you today. Thank you for tuning in.